Welcome back to PJ Takes 5. Today is Friday, August 29th, and the time for a college football preview is finally here. But we start the day off with the only appropriate news, the league-shattering alert that the Dallas Cowboys have traded star edge rusher MICAH Parsons to the Green Bay Packers for 2 first-round picks and defensive tackle Kenny Clark. This is a saga that we've talked a lot about on this show and one that has really dominated the entire NFL offseason, especially over the past couple months. Will Parsons get a new deal in Dallas? Will he get traded? And Thursday, we finally saw Parsons get his wish and get traded to a different team, going up to the Packers, joining that star-studded NFC North, and help lead that defense to a championship. Parsons finally got the contract he wanted, a 4-year, $188 million deal in Green Bay with about $128 million fully guaranteed at signing. Second player ever, alongside Reggie White, to record 12-plus sacks in each of his first 4 seasons. He's the first former first-round pick who made a Pro Bowl each of his first 4 years and will now play that 5th year with a different team, one of 29 guys to be in that category, but the first of that group to ever be on a different team that following year. So definitely an unprecedented move and one that really shakes up the NFL power balance. Starting out with the Packers side of it, they bring in a player, all-pro caliber player who can affect the defense by himself, and as a player that any offense really has to game plan for and have a good plan week in and week out to make sure that he doesn't beat them single-handedly. From the problematic side of the Packers, they become the first team to have 2 players taking up $100 million or more of salary cap. So between him and Jordan Love, a lot of that salary cap table is tied up in 2 players, which is never the best way to go about it, to be super top heavy, but we're in a different era where salary cap's rising and bigger players are demanding more money. So part of the modern NFL here, you got to do what you have to do to get really good players on board, and Parsons is certainly that. The jury is still a little bit out on Jordan Love. They paid him like he's in that Joe Burrow, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson tier, and we just really haven't seen the production, statistically or team production, thus far. Not saying that's impossible, but they kind of took a waiver on him early, hoping that he would become that quarterback, that Aaron Rodgers, Brett Favre, Packers legendary quarterback for them. And we still haven't seen that quite yet. So double downing on the risk of the investment in Jordan Love and saying that this is definitely the right guy to lead the ship on offense. And now they got the right guy on defense to lead the ship in Parsons. But again, really top heavy contract layout, and it'll be a little bit of a risk to see how much longer they can have so much money tied up at top. They have some good players who are coming up for new contracts here, starting with a couple of receivers, Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs, and then linebacker Quay Walker, all of whom are free agents at the end of this year. So being able to invest in a player like Parsons, but then having a question mark of whether or not you can bring back some of your own guys as they become free agents and age out that rookie contract is definitely a question mark. But you have to look at the compensation they gave up. 2 first-round picks for a team who is, planning to be a playoff team and be picking in the late 20s to early 30s. That's definitely not too bad of a trade package to surrender. And Clark, a really good player who's been there for a while, but entering that 29-year season and is going to start maxing out of his abilities on the field. I think he's a really strong player and an underrated player who's been with the Packers for a while, but you're probably not giving up too much. I think that defensive tackle room is a little light still. I know they got Carl Brooks in there, but not the traditional big defensive tackle room that we've seen in recent years, going all the way back to, BJ Raji and Mike Daniels in there. So there's still a couple holes in that roster. I look at the D tackles, and I think wide receiver is still kind of missing the number 1 receiver. Maybe Matthew Golden ages into that and grows into that spot. Still some questions on the interior of the offensive line. Still some questions at cornerback, but you have a quarterback, you have an elite edge rusher, and that's kind of what the Packers are focusing on going forward, and seeing if the top end of their roster can't bring along the younger, cheaper guys as they get into an even younger state here, placing a 29-year-old frontline player with a 26-year-old who's more aging into his prime and has already done a lot in this league is definitely a way to signal that you're trying to get younger and be productive despite having some younger guys on the team there. So from the Packers, definitely a home run move to get headed into the season here. For the Cowboys, obviously a lot of uncertainty about what the future holds. They have a bunch of players, Dak Prescott, Terrence Steele, Trayvon Diggs, CeeDee Lamb, who are taking up a lot of money, and now you just got rid of perhaps the best player on your team. If you're the Cowboys, you probably wish you could have gotten a little more in that return. Whenever a team is trading for a player that they have to turn around and re-sign, it's easier to not give up that much because the argument is that we're going to get rid of a lot of cap space here, but still probably would have looked to get more than just 2 first-rounders. not even 3 first rounders, but 2 first and a third, 2 first and some fourths, whatever it takes. But definitely just to get 2 picks and then a player was a little bit underwhelming from the Cowboys standpoint. And then overall, you just have to say this is probably not a great message for the guys in that locker room that you're serious about winning now. Like I said, they have a lot of players that are in their prime or on the back end of it, and they've invested in them heavily, and it's going to be hard to walk into that locker room and tell those guys that as a team, we're doing everything we can to win now and be competitive at the top end of the league after getting rid of one of the best defensive players across the entire NFL. But that's an issue for the Cowboys coaches. And on the defensive side, Matt Eberflus to team people up a little bit more. I know they talked about in the press conference that Jerry Jones and Stephen Jones held last night that they're still very confident in their group that they have. For those guys in that locker room who just lost their leader and the best player on the team, definitely a hard sell going into this season that you're going to turn around week 1 and beat the defending Super Bowl champion Philadelphia Eagles in a big divisional game there. Definitely a win for the Packers. For the Cowboys, a little bit of a head scratcher. But as I've been saying, between the Parsons, Trey Hendrickson, and Terry McLaurin deals all this offseason, the Parsons one definitely felt different from those, and that it was more about just the money, and it was a systemic difference between him and the organization, and then he got his way and is out of that team and doesn't have to worry about Jerry Jones trying to pull off behind the scenes negotiations and doing stuff in an unorthodox way. So good for Parsons to get the most money for a non-quarterback in league history. Truly generational wealth for a guy who's been really productive in the NFL thus far and doesn't look to be slowing down anytime soon. So just had to start with the NFL news. Rest of the show will all be college football heading into the weekend here, first weekend of actual college football across the entire nation. So we're going to start off with a little bit of a playoff prediction here, looking at who we think are going to fill out the top 12 teams in the college football playoffs later this fall and into the start of 2026 year. So as you know, the first, not top 5 seeds, but the first 5 seeds that get automatic bids are all conference champions. So we have the 4 power conferences between the Big Ten, the SEC, the ACC, and the Big 12. Pac-12 still exists, but we're just put a couple teams in there, so they're probably not going to get a berth unless Washington State or somebody really shows out this year. So starting out with the five conference champions who are going to get automatic bids, just going to say each team and then just a little quick blurb about them without going into too much detail here, but in no particular order, starting with the Big Ten champion, I'm going to predict the Penn State Nittany Lions make it in and win that conference. Starting with their quarterback, I think Drew Aller is a really good young player and has a lot of rawness to work through, and will have to develop into being a better decision maker and making better reads and not just trusting his physical ability so much. I know last year they had Tyler Warren, who played all over the field and was a first round pick and got the quarterback out of some sticky situations here and there, but it's going to be time for Aller to step up and make that next year leap and become a better pocket passer and game manager and decision maker. But I'm really happy that he decided to stay in the college ranks and didn't go out early. I think he has a lot of room to grow, and if he can take that next step, I think Penn State becomes a really dangerous team and can pass that hump of the Ohio States and Oregons of the world and take that Big Ten conference. Into the SEC, I have Texas winning, number 1 ranked team in the preseason. Obviously got a big battle against Ohio State to start off here on Saturday. But again, with the quarterback, you talk about Arch Manning, potential to be the best Sark quarterback ever, which is saying something. He's worked with Quinn Ewers, Mac Jones, Tua Tagovailoa, Jake Locker, Mark Sanchez, Matt Leinart, Carson Palmer, all really stellar quarterbacks who've gone on to do pretty good things in the NFL for most part. But Arch, with the family pedigree and just the ability that we've seen in short glimpses at Texas behind Ewers and throughout high school, I think Arch is a player who can come in and hit the ground running week 1 and really lead that offense to heights that they haven't really seen here and get them over the hump into being a true national contender. Texas was pretty close last year, losing what was in the end and not particularly close game against Ohio State, but in reality came down to the last drive or two. So getting a little bit of an upgrade from Quinn Ewers to Arch Manning could be enough to put Texas over the top. Heading to the ACC, I think their champion is going to be Clemson. Clemson was really good for a stretch there between Deshaun Watson and Trevor Lawrence, and then kind of a back seat. They have a pretty good model right now of winning with a good quarterback and Cade Klubnik, and then having just a really strong defensive line. They got TJ Parker, Peter Woods, DeMonte Capehart will help. Having an offense you can run through a talented player like Klubnik, and then having a defense that can get after people and create havoc in the opposing backfield, I think is a really strong way to win in college, especially where some of the protections maybe aren't so sophisticated and quarterbacks are relying more on coaches rather than what they're seeing out there. So I think in the ACC, Clemson has a real good shot to make a lot of stuff happen and be really good on offense and just be really disruptive up front defensively. Moving on down to the Big 12 here, I got Arizona State repeating as champions there. Lost a lot of their offensive firepower with Cam Scatabo going to the NFL, and he was just such a big part of that offense, kind of like Tyler Warren, a player who wore so many hats for them, running, catching out of the backfield, even passing here and there. So it's going to be hard to replace those numbers and that production, but I'm a really big believer in their head coach, Kenny Dillingham. Just seems to be the type of guy that the players respond to and kind of works for the modern college football where you have these real young guys kind of living in a different world, and he's a guy who can relate to them and can coach them up pretty well and get them in good spots schematically to perform well and produce well. So I have them repeating in the Big 12, and then going down to our kind of wild card-ish conference champion, I actually have James Madison winning it out of the Sun Belt. Well-coached team with Bob Chesney up there. Lost a lot of talent heading into last season with their former head coach Kurt Cignetti going to Indiana and bringing a lot of guys over, but they should be even better this year. I think they were 9-4 last season, but retooled and got some more top-end talent for that higher end of the roster, and they're a newer team in the FBS ranks, but a team that, like I said, is coached well and has a coach who's really trying to take that next step, and getting a team like James Madison into the college football playoff can basically get him to anywhere he wants to go that has an opening at the end of this year. So I think for the players who are looking to potentially transfer to bigger programs, I think for Chesney, who's potentially trying to get to a bigger program, there's a lot of incentive for these guys to really show out in the Sun Belt and win that conference and be a team who won't end up being a top 5 seed in the playoffs, but will be an automatic bid if they can win that conference and do so better than some of the other smaller conferences. Those are my 5 conference champions, heading down to the 7 wild cards that we'll see. The obvious one, Notre Dame, would be in that top 5 list, except for their independent school. And for me, it just starts with Jeremiah Love, that running back, one of the better players in college football, and was one of the better players in the playoffs last year. We saw that with that big performance against Penn State. I think he'll just have a ridiculous usage rate. These will be pretty short games for Notre Dame where try to play some really stifling defense and then just hand the ball over to Love and let him churn it out and chew clock and chew up yardage and get the offense into goal line situations and just be like the battering ram that team really needs to win the game control and the clock management game throughout the year here. So I think Notre Dame's a pretty easy bet to get in. Another pretty easy bet wildcard team, Ohio State at the Big Ten. Lost a lot from last year with offense and defense. A bunch of guys moving to the NFL, but still one of the most talented teams in all of college football. With Jeremiah Smith at receiver and Caleb Downs at free safety, 2 of the best players in the entire country, and a team that is gonna find a way to win enough games and get in the voters' eyes enough to move on to the playoffs. Very similar situation, Georgia, a team that I don't have winning the SEC, but being very competitive and holding a lot of roster talent that people are going to be interested in. Even though they've taken a little bit of a step back since winning back-to-back championships, they're still producing NFL caliber talent at just a crazy level. And that talent's going to show up day in and day out, week in and week out for these Bulldogs. And I really imagine that a lot would have to go wrong for them to miss the playoffs this year. Another Big Ten team that I really like, Oregon. Another team that lost a lot of talent, but I look at that head coach, Dan Lanning, and similar to Dillingham at Arizona State, I think is just such a great leader for today's day and age of college football, a guy who can relate to these young players and can get them in good positions to win. I really think that he'll continue his ascent to star coaching ranks and get Oregon into the playoffs yet again. Alabama out of the SEC, I have making it again. Kalen DeBoer taking over from Saban is definitely a tough spot to be in, and they struggled last year a little bit comparatively to what we've seen out of the Crimson Tide over the past X number of decades, basically. But a roster that I think has a lot of talent, especially on the defense. More on that later. But DeBoer, I think, will show people why he was the right guy to take that job, and we'll get those Crimson Tide into the playoffs. Another SEC team, I have LSU. Another team that just has crazy talent, starting with Garrett Nussmeier at quarterback and then Harold Perkins on defense. Perkins was a player who missed a bunch of time last season, only played 4 games, but maybe the most versatile defender in college football. And then Nussmeier, a quarterback who has the respect of that entire program and a player that they're really banking on taking them to the next steps. I think LSU makes it, and then to round it out, another Big Ten team here, I got Illinois making it. Brett Bielema, nose football coach that I really admire, and a guy who I think covets size and physicality and power, especially in the trenches, offense and defense. So you got all this strength up front, and then the man in the middle holding it all down, Luke Altmaier at quarterback. I think he's just a very solid quarterback, not like Lenore Sellers of the world where the physicals are unbelievable, but a guy who knows his role and can game manage very well and isn't going to lose you a lot of games, if any. So I have Illinois unofficially that 12th ranked team. None of those teams were listed in order necessarily, but I think Illinois is able to sneak in and potentially win a game or two to really put that program back on the map and get them rolling for the future here. So all those teams, like I said, champion from every conference, and then from the wild cards, I have Notre Dame as an independent, and then everybody else from the SEC or Big Ten. So I think we're going to see a pretty SEC and Big Ten heavy playoff, which wouldn't be that surprising. It was kind of the same way last year, but stay in that mold of those two conferences really being the true powerhouses and seeing teams beat up on each other, but getting the respect of the voters and having a lot of teams get in from those respective conferences. So moving on down here are some yearly picks. I have yearly picks that are real awards, and then we'll get into some that are kind of more fake awards that I'm giving out here, but these are my predictions for this season. So starting with Heisman, we mentioned him with Clemson, but quarterback Cade Klubnik, 3,600 yards and 36 touchdowns last year. You know, if he does help lead that Tigers offense to an ACC title, I think he's a shoo-in for that Heisman Trophy winner. Hasn't been too long since we've seen a Clemson quarterback win that trophy, but he could be just the next in a line of really good college quarterbacks. So I have Cade Klubnik there, Coach of the Year. This is an unpopular one, but I have James Franklin. I think this is a year that Penn State's able to kind of break through that ceiling of, you know, losing to Ohio State or losing to Oregon and can beat some really good teams. And if they do, I think his ability will finally be put on notice. I think he's a really good coach. He doesn't really have too many of those signature wins. If Penn State can make it really far in that playoff conversation, I think he's probably in that conversation for Coach of the Year, and a guy who's been around for a while and has done it for a while at a pretty high level and just hasn't really been able to get that recognition yet. So I have this year as the year that Penn State breaks through and he wins Coach of the Year. Going down to the Davey O'Brien Award for the best quarterback. Like I said at the top, I have Drew Aller from Penn State. Super raw player, but we'll have more on his shoulders with Tyler Warren gone. So I view that as it's a negative because he has to do more and there's less of a security blanket around him. But the positive is if they are a really good team, that just means that he did take that step up and played with maybe a little bit less talent at that receiver position, which we'll get to in a little bit here as well. But out the backfield, they have some good running backs. But if they go really far, it'll mean that he had a really good year. So kind of assuming that Penn State sticks around here for a while, I'll have Drew Aller as that Davey O'Brien winner. And I should have said at the top that I'm not going to do any repeats. So obviously, if a quarterback wins the Heisman Trophy, he could also very well easily win that Davey O'Brien Trophy. But just for the sake of talking about different guys here, none of these are going to be repeats. So moving on down to the Doak Walker Award for the best running back, I have Jeremiah Love from Notre Dame. Absolutely took over last year against Penn State in a game where he was actually pretty hobbled in that college football playoff and put the team on his shoulders and really brought them to that college football championship game. Obviously didn't get a lot of run there with that injury, but I think this season will have an even higher usage rate. Like I said, I think they want to play really good defensive football and have him chew out the game and chew out the clock a little bit. So he's going to be a big part of that offense, obviously, and could very well end up being the first running back taken in next April's draft. Going down to the Fred Biletnikoff winner here for the best wide receiver, I have Jeremiah Smith from Ohio State. As a freshman last year, 1,300 yards and 16 touchdowns. A really productive season in his first year out there. The quarterback situation is going to be a little different with Will Howard out and Julian Sayin in. But as long as Sayin can identify him and get the ball to him in space and throw up jump balls to him, I think he's going to have a potentially even more productive season at Ohio State. Going down to the John Mackey Award here for the best tight end, I have Eli Stowers from Vanderbilt. Really interesting player, converted tight end after starting at quarterback for New Mexico State. Has a really good connection with Diego Pavia, the returning quarterback. So I think a player who is super athletic, has a pretty good understanding of the quarterback position and what those guys are looking for back there. And a player who, not unlike Travis Kelce, I know that's a pretty big comparison to make for a young guy here, but a guy who kind of can be a quarterback's best friend and get into spaces and identify stuff at the line of scrimmage to know where the openings are going to be in zone coverage, how to out leverage a guy in man coverage, where to be to get the ball in space and in time from a quarterback. I think he has that next level sense at the position, and to play with a guy that he played with last year in Pavia will only continue to form that relationship. And I think those two are going to be set up for pretty big numbers here. So I have him as the John Mackey Award winner. Ted Hendricks Award winner for the best defensive end, I have Dylan Stewart at South Carolina. 6.5 sacks last year as a freshman. Potentially the best South Carolina defensive end since Jadeveon Clowney, which is certainly saying something, but just a super athletic player who's going to cause a lot of disruption in the SEC and a guy that has to be game planned for week in and week out, no matter who they're playing. Chuck McNarick Award winner for the best defensive player, I have Caleb Downs from Ohio State. Like I said, one of the best safeties in all of college football. 81 tackles last season, 2 picks and 6 pass deflections. is an interesting player because he plays in a scheme where he can play close enough to the line of scrimmage to really affect stuff in the run game and short pass game, but is obviously also on responsibility in deep center field, so he can play that roamer and just lurking for picks over the middle. A player who is going to give a lot of quarterbacks fits and plays a little bit scheme independently at times and just kind of going off true ball feel and where he thinks he should be, but a player who has been one of the better players in college football dating back to the start of last season, and I don't see him slowing down anytime soon. Next up, the Butkus Award winner for the best linebacker. I have Texas's Anthony Hill Jr. Just a prototypical linebacker, and we don't see anymore. 6'3", 240 pounds. Real true leader of that defense and a really talented group that looks up to him as the guy who's going to get people in the right spot and make the right plays in the front seven there. So a guy who I think just brings that energy and tenacity to that Texas Longhorns defense. For the Jim Thorpe winner for the best DB, I have Leonard Moore from Notre Dame. 11 pass breakups as a freshman corner last season, which is pretty impressive, but just a long, rangy, lanky cornerback at 6'2", who should be seeing some pretty good receivers across from him throughout the year and will have opportunities to shadow them and get his hands on some balls and hopefully bring down balls or at least tip them to guys in the backfield there. Fits that mold of what they're looking for and can play pretty close coverage, but a guy who should be pretty productive this year, and if Notre Dame makes a run, he'll be a big part of that defensive backfield and a big part of that defense in general. So those were all the real award winners that I'm predicting, going down to some fake yearly awards. We're just going to go best team offense here, starting with Penn State. So I've talked a lot about Drew Aller, but looking at that running back rotation between Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen, just a really strong 1-2 punch. Probably doesn't get any better this season in college football. Combined last year for 2,200 yards and 25 touchdowns. The offense as a group has a little bit of a question mark at wide receiver. Both Caden Saunders and Josiah Brown are set to miss significant times with injuries before the season started, but from that backfield alone, just a lot of production and a lot of really talented stuff to work with, and a group that will be really hard to game plan for, whether it's trying to keep Aller in the pocket and keeping the top on defense or just trying to contain those two running backs who are going to be able to sub in for one another, so no one's ever really too banged up or too tired. That's definitely a big task at hand for defenses, and one that probably won't go super well for a lot of defenses in the Big Ten. Best team defense, I have Alabama. They run that kind of 3-3 scheme, which is a little funky, pretty DB heavy, but they have stars at every level. I was looking at PFF earlier, which is not the end-all be-all in terms of ranking players, but they do have a top 10 player at every position in their rankings. So it just speaks to that talent that they've been able to invest in on that defense. Was obviously a big part of the Saban years at Bama, just having really strong defenses, especially in the secondary, and a group that seems to have gotten back to that production level and talent level. So I expect a big year from that unit. Biggest surprise in college football, I'll give to Illinois. Being a little underlooked right now, I know a lot of people have some talks about them being productive in the Big Ten, but I think they're going to be a real tough team to play week in and week out. Bellama, former player himself, is just real tough, and he's going to have that team really sound in the middle on offense and defense. And like I said, Luke Altmaier, I think, is just a really strong college quarterback who's seen a lot and has a lot of experience and can be a really strong game manager as well. So I have them as a tough team. Probably the biggest surprise of it's going to come to January and it's going to be the round of 8 or 4, and they're going to be sticking around, and they're just going to be a real tough out for a lot of these kind of traditional powerhouses in college football. Biggest letdown team, maybe biggest disappointment, I have Miami. I'm not really sold on the Carson Beck experience, especially after what we've seen from Georgia, where he had a lot more talent to work with. Had a lot of turnover on the offensive group around him at wide receiver and running back, losing a lot of players to the transfer portal. So I just questions about Carson Beck, a lot of questions about the talent around him. I just don't think they have the top end talent, especially on offense, that will have them in the conversation to be in the playoffs. And they're ranked 10 right now, and I don't think they'll live up to that hype necessarily. And then some more player-specific ones. I have a player who should return next season in college football, Arch Manning. I think he's going to have a really strong year at Texas. Experience is such an important thing for young quarterbacks going to the NFL rank, and I think he could really use the time. And, I know he sat behind Quinn Ewers last year, but to have another year of starting experience will only do him better when he goes to the NFL in 2027, we'll call it. I'd really like to see him play well this year, but then at the end of the season commit to coming back to Texas and one more year under Sark and getting everything done there that he needs to before moving on to the NFL ranks. Hot seat of the year, I have Brian Kelly, head coach for LSU. So looking at his recent past, not including COVID year, he had 29 wins in his first 3 years at LSU, which is a significant drop from his 34 wins in his last 3 seasons at Notre Dame. 4 losses in 2 of his last 3 seasons at LSU. I just think when they were a really good team and we're looking for a coach to take them to that next level, Brian Kelly seemed like a good option. But kind of as we're looking at it here in present day, he seems to be not the coach that's going to necessarily add wins to that roster and coach them beyond their capabilities and talent levels. Probably needs to have a big year, otherwise I imagine LSU would want to turn it over to somebody new and somebody who can count those players a little differently. Obviously, there's some personal stuff with him that kind of rubs people the wrong way, both around college football and potentially even on the team with the faking the accent and everything. But just a funky guy that I think is running on a short fuse in LSU there. And this is a fun one, most collegiate football player of the year. So college football, we love it for its wackiness. So who's a player that really embodies that? I think BYU quarterback Bear Bachmeier playing QB. His brother Tiger is on the team at receiver. But Bear, true freshman quarterback, wears number 47. Will be the first true freshman quarterback to start a season opener for BYU ever. Played middle linebacker till late in middle school there, so a real tough kid. I think he's just kind of an oddball guy and a player that you don't really see a lot of in the world, where a lot of these guys are kind of prep school kids who play a lot of college football or are just athletic freaks who have a really good nose for the game. But he stands out as a guy who is kind of what college football is all about, playing at a slightly smaller school, playing an important position with a weird number, with a cool name. He's half Thai. His mom's from Thailand, so it's an interesting setup, and it'll be interesting to watch BYU down the stretch here and see what he can do for them in his first season. And the last one here, I have dumbest rule change of the year. So last year, this would have gone to the inclusion of the 2-minute warning, which takes some of the fun of college football away. But for this year, I have the injury timeout situation. We saw this a little bit in week 0, especially that game in Dublin and that Hawaii-Stanford game. But the new rule is that if the ball is spotted and a player goes down for an injury, even if it's a real injury, that team will be penalized with a timeout. And it's a good rule in theory, just to take away that faking a timeout to get the clock stopped and everything, but there's going to be a big game at some point where somebody's actually really hurt with an ACL or an Achilles or some real injury, and because of the timing, they get penalized for a timeout, and it's going to be a really crappy situation where a really good college football player is hurt, and then the team also loses a timeout. So I don't really get the way that they put it in. I don't think it'll stick along for a while before something has to change with that, but I have that as the dumbest rule change heading into the year. And then finally, going down here, some week 1 picks. I call this OUFD. I'm going to try to do this every week for college and pro football, and then report back at the end of the week and then at the end of the season my totals. But trying to pick an over, under, favorite, and dog throughout the weekly slate. So there's a couple disclaimers here. Definitely not any betting advice. Definitely not financial advice. I'll try to pick big games from like bigger conference games or teams that people are more likely to watch games. We'll update following the weekend. I'm using ESPN Bet just because it's the one that I can see on ESPN there. And these will all be as of Thursday night, so the day before the show comes out, just because that's the newest information. So obviously all these lines are subject to change, and they probably will before kickoff, just because lines are dependent on who's betting what money. With all that out of the way, we'll get right into the first week here, and hopefully you can go 4-0 and report back on Tuesday that everything went pretty well. So starting with my first over, I have Texas at Ohio State, 47.5. Essentially the debut for both Arch Manning and Julian Sayin. Both teams super talented on defense, so you would think why the over, especially with the linebacker we talked about, Anthony Hill Jr. and Caleb Downs at safety for Ohio State. But between Sark and Ryan Day with their new quarterbacks, I think this will be an opportunity for both teams to show out and get those guys in the big positions, and we'll see some trick plays and some big explosive plays, especially with Jeremiah Smith for Ohio State. So 47.5. I think the last time these two teams played in the playoffs last year was 28-14, so that's 42 points. So that was pretty close anyways. And certainly Ohio State's defense last year is probably a step up from what they have this year. First big game of the weekend, first game at all for these two teams. I think we'll see 48 points at least in that game. Going to our first under here, I have under 49.5 for Notre Dame at Miami. The Irish's whole MO will be running the ball with Jeremiah Love, like we talked about, and then playing really strong defense. And I think that'll be pretty suffocating for Carson Beck, who, like I said, doesn't have the top-end talent that he's had at receiver and running back this year. They had Cam Ward at quarterback last year and were a pretty good unit, but I don't think Carson Beck is quite the quarterback that Ward is. And we've seen their early returns from him in the NFL before they even played, just to be a really good quarterback and a really strong leader. And I think Carson Beck doesn't really quite have that top-end level to him. So I think Notre Dame will win, but I think they'll do it in a really stifling way that shuts down the offense and doesn't involve scoring a lot of points. So I think that's a relatively safe under. Definitely boring to bet and watch an under, but I have that going under. My favorite here, Clemson -4.5 over LSU. I think Clemson's going to really try to hit the ground running between Cade Klubnik at quarterback and then that defensive line that they have that should be getting after Garrett Nussmeier, who I think is a very good quarterback. I just think out the gate for them, LSU, they're not going to be able to put the pieces together, and I really like Clemson winning by 5 points or more and getting out of there alive. So that's my favorite. And then my dog of the week, the first game with no ranked teams, but a game that everyone's gonna be watching on Monday night there. North Carolina covering 3.5 over TCU. Not that they'll win the game necessarily, but covering the number. Belichick's first game in the collegiate ranks, there's a lot on the line for him. Him and Tom Brady break up at the Patriots, and Brady goes down to Tampa Bay and immediately wins the Super Bowl and is really productive in the postseason and regular season in general with the Bucs. So Belichick's got a lot to prove that he had a really big part of that Patriots regime, and everything going on with his girlfriend Jordan Hudson is kind of a whatever, and he's still the guy who's one of the best coaches of all time. So I think he's going to really try to come out and press TCU and just kind of throw the kitchen sink at them. So I believe in Bill Belichick, the dog, there at 3.5 points. Like I said, they might not win, but I think they'll be a closer game than that if they were to lose. But yeah, I'll definitely be watching that game Monday night, even though neither of those teams are ranked. Wouldn't be surprised if North Carolina does end up ranked, if not by the end of the season, at some point in there, but have high hopes of Bill Belichick at the college ranks and to see if he can't crack those guys into a little bit better shape at UNC. So that's all I have for the first week of college football. Super excited to watch everything unfold this weekend. I'll be back Tuesday to go over those picks and see what went right and went wrong. And then this time next week, we'll do another preview for the NFL season. Will probably be a very similar layout where we have some real awards and some fake awards and some predicting of playoffs and Super Bowl champion. But yeah, and I should say, going back to my college football playoff predictions, who I think actually wins this year, I think Ohio State doesn't necessarily win the Big Ten, but I do believe in them being the college football champions going back to back here. We've seen back-to-backs recently, obviously most recently with Georgia, but they're a pretty good team that has just a lot of talent. Jeremiah Smith's going to be such a big part of that offense and is maybe one of the most dynamic players in college football. Heading into week one here, I'll say Ohio State is my college football champion. Obviously, nobody cares, so I have the right to change that whenever I want, but that's what I think right now, and I'm excited to get the first week in the college football on their way here with that game against Texas Saturday morning to really start off the big-time playoff change in college football. So excited to watch this weekend, excited to come back Tuesday and talk about what I saw and what I thought. Not super excited to see MICAH Parsons in a Green Bay Packers jersey, going back to the very first topic there, but definitely a busy time in football, and I'll be here to talk about it as it comes up. So have a good weekend watching college football, and I'll talk to you guys on Tuesday. Bye.